My name is Vanessa Carter. I am 36 years old. I live alone in a small apartment in Plano, Texas, just over 10 minutes drive from the house where I grew up. For nearly 6 years, almost every extra dollar I had flowed into one single place, the mortgage on the family home. I always thought that, when the final payment was officially recorded, there would be some kind of moment. It didn't have to be big, just real. Maybe a quiet dinner in the kitchen. Maybe my father looking at me and saying, "I know what you did," but what I received instead was a phone call. No greeting, no small talk. My father's voice. Paul Carter came through the phone, flat and steady. "I know you paid off the loan. All of it. But your mother and I have decided to give the house to your brother as his graduation gift." I stood completely frozen. The phone pressed to my ear, my eyes fixed on the white wall in front of me. For a very brief moment, I honestly thought I had heard him wrong. But he wasn't finished. "Oh, and you don't need to come to the party. I don't want you bringing a negative attitude to your brother's big day." My mouth went dry. My younger brother Noah, the one who was always praised as having a future, while I worked double shifts, saved every receipt just to keep that house from falling into the bank's hands. And now, I was the problem. I asked my father if he was serious. He sighed, as if I were being unreasonable. "Don't always turn everything into money. Families should be happy for each other." Then he hung up. I sat there for a long time. The only sound in the room was the steady hum of the air conditioner. Finally, I turned to the one person who had always known every payment I made, every number I had sacrificed. I spoke very quietly. "Do you think they'll say it themselves? Or should I?" 3 days later, my brother's graduation celebration no longer felt like a celebration at all. But before I tell you how everything came crashing down, tell me where you are watching from, what time it is there, and whether you have ever felt invisible in your own family. If you have, stay. Because this is the story of the responsible child, who finally stopped staying silent. The call had ended, but there was one person who knew the truth better than anyone. The phone screen went dark. The kitchen returned to its familiar sounds, the dishwasher still running mid-cycle, the air conditioner blowing steadily, as if nothing had happened. I stood still. For a long time. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I only felt my hands grow cold, even though outside the window, Plano was still hot. On the counter lay an unopened electricity bill. On the floor, beside the chair, was the canvas tote I used every weekend. Everything looked suspiciously normal. I walked to the window. Light from the parking lot cast a thin yellow streak across the white wall. In that moment, one thought became painfully clear. If they dared to say it out loud like that, it meant they believed I would stay silent. I turned back to the kitchen table, picked up my phone, searched for a name I hadn't called in months. Leonard answered on the second ring. "Vanessa." His voice was low, calm, as if he had already expected this call to come. "I just found out," I said. No small talk. About the house. A brief pause. Not the kind caused by shock, but the kind that comes from weighing something carefully. "What did Paul say?" Leonard asked. "He's giving it to Noah. A graduation gift." I waited for his reaction. But he didn't gasp. He didn't laugh. He didn't swear. He only said one sentence. "So that's the way they chose." The way he used the word chose made my stomach tighten. "Should I go to the party?" I asked. "As a test." Leonard paused. "That's not the most important question right now." His voice lowered. "Vanessa, I need to ask you something clearly. You kept all the paperwork, didn't you?" "I've never thrown anything away." I replied. That was the truth. I didn't keep them out of ambition. I kept them out of fear. Fear that one day I would need to prove I hadn't imagined everything. Good, he said. Because there are certain things that cannot be considered a gift the way they're telling it. I closed my eyes. What are you talking about? Leonard didn't answer directly. He only said, there are structures created during a crisis, and those structures don't disappear just because someone wants to tell a pretty story. I opened my eyes, looked toward the hallway. Under the bed in my bedroom, there was a gray plastic box. Inside were folders I had never fully reread from beginning to end. Tomorrow, Leonard said, you should bring everything to my office. I hung up, walked into the bedroom, pulled the box out of the shadows. The lid popped open softly, but the name printed on the very first page made my heart stall. Maybe I had never been as powerless as they thought. I did not grow up in a bad family. I grew up in a family that had no place for me. The house in Plano was always kept neat. The lawn was mowed on schedule, the curtains matched, family photos hung straight on the walls. From the outside, we looked like a model family, but in those photos, I was always standing slightly off to the side, not close enough to be noticed, not far enough to disappear completely. My father liked to talk about family as a shared project. Everyone had a role, everyone had to understand their position, and I learned my position very early. In the evenings, when Noah talked about school, my father leaned toward him, asking question after question. When it was my turn, he simply nodded. Yeah, as long as it's fine. My mother would usually look at me afterward and give a small smile, not a cruel smile, just the smile of someone who had grown used to things never changing. I began to understand in this house, I did not need to be taken care of. I needed not to cause trouble. That time, I was 13 years old. The school organized an end-of-term field trip. I brought the permission slip home and placed it neatly on the dining table. My father glanced at it. Didn't pick it up. Leave it there, he said. I need to look at the budget. A week later, I saw Noah with a new jacket, the kind kids at school wore in winter. I asked my mother, very quietly. She said, your brother's old one doesn't fit anymore. Yours still does. The permission slip was still there. Not torn, not answered, just forgotten. That night, I folded it up and put it back into my backpack. I didn't ask again. That was the first time I understood something important. If I didn't ask, no one would notice anything missing. By high school, I started working part-time. At first, just weekends, then evenings too. The money wasn't much, but it was enough that I didn't have to ask. When I told my father I would pay for my own extracurricular activities, he just said, good. A grown daughter should be independent. That same year, Noah was enrolled in an expensive test prep program. My father called it an investment in the future. I didn't ask why my future didn't need investing. My mother would bring me a plate of food late at night when I came home from my shift. She set it on the table, said nothing. Just rested her hand lightly on my shoulder, a gesture enough to say she knew, but not enough to change anything. I ate in silence. From the living room came the sound of the television, where my father and brother were watching a game. And I understood one more thing: I wasn't being abandoned. I was being trained to erase myself. Everything began to slip, with envelopes no one opened. It didn't all collapse at once. It frayed. The store my father once proudly mentioned at family gatherings started losing customers. Phone calls came later. Voices grew quieter. My mother stopped asking what I ate each night. One time, when I visited home, I pulled the wrong kitchen drawer. Inside was a thick stack of envelopes, all printed with bank logos, unopened, unripped. I stood there for a long time, listening to the clock tick, listening to the wind brush against the window. I didn't need to read them to understand what was coming. That evening, my father talked about a few difficult months, about tightening our belts. Then he turned to Noah and told him to focus on studying for his final term. No one asked what I thought. No one needed my answer. I sat on my old bed. The room hadn't changed much, only I had. I opened my laptop, wrote down my income, subtracted rent, subtracted what could be cut. What remained was just enough to do something I knew would slow my life down. If I helped pay, I would postpone changing jobs, postpone trips, postpone building something of my own. I closed the laptop, looked at the wall where my high school posters used to hang. The decision came quietly. No vows, no tears. I just thought, at least, they won't lose the house. The transfers started after that. Regular, silent. No one in the family talked about them. My father told relatives he was struggling to hold on to the house. My mother cooked small meals for me whenever I stopped by. No one said thank you, and I didn't wait for it. Around the second year, Leonard Shaw asked to meet me. He didn't say much, just placed a few papers in front of me and explained slowly. In a crisis, he said, people tend to sign things they don't read carefully. I skimmed them, saw my father's name, saw long clauses, and saw my own name appear in an appendix. I'm just paying, I said. I don't need anything else. Leonard looked at me for a long time. Then he said something I never forgot. If you carry the weight, then something has to stand on your side. I nodded, signed, didn't ask more. I thought I was doing the right thing. I didn't know I had just placed a boundary my family had never seen. Years later, when I reread those pages, I finally understood. Some things don't wait for you to speak up. They wait for you to realize you already have the right. There are truths that do not need to be exposed by anyone. They reveal themselves the moment you stop trying to be recognized. That night, I didn't turn on the living room lights. I left only the faint glow from the kitchen spilling into the hallway. Plano was so quiet I could clearly hear the refrigerator cycle on, then off. Everything in the small apartment was in its place. Too perfectly, as if I had arranged my entire life to avoid inconveniencing anyone. I sat down in the chair, didn't pick up my phone, didn't turn on the television. I just let time pass. In that silence, old phrases came back. You're independent. You don't need it. Let this part be for your brother. They didn't echo out loud. They were just there like a thin layer of dust settling over every decision I had made for years. And I realized something with absolute clarity. I hadn't been waiting for recognition. I had trained myself not to need it. I stood up and walked into the bedroom, opened the drawer, took out an old notebook, not a diary, just scattered notes, work hours, money transfers, things I handled on my own. I flipped through page after page. There wasn't a single line that said, "They asked me," only lines that said, "I will do it." In that moment, I understood why everything had unfolded the way it had. Not because I was invisible, but because I had always positioned myself just behind everyone else, a place others could lean on without ever having to look back. I thought about my mother, the touches on my shoulder, the small meals, the hesitant looks. She knew, but she chose stability over fairness. I thought about my father, the way he told the family story as if there had only ever been one person carrying the weight. And I had allowed him to do that through my silence. That truth didn't make me angry. It made me clear. I folded the notebook shut, placed it back into the drawer, gently, like finishing a task that was already complete. I had no intention of calling anyone that night. No explaining, no arguing, no need to say that I had been hurt. Because for the first time, I understood explanations are for people who are willing to listen. I stood in front of the mirror, not to search for answers, just to look directly at the person who had carried everything in silence. From now on, I said very softly, everything goes through me. Not a threat, not a promise of revenge, just a new boundary set, not with anger, but with clarity. And when I turned off the light and the apartment sank into darkness, I knew I had just done something my family had never imagined. I stopped making myself smaller, so they could feel comfortable. That party didn't begin with applause. It began with the way every pair of eyes slid past me. The backyard was strung with soft yellow lights, a long table covered in white cloth, plastic cups lined up in rows, the smell of grilled meat mixed with freshly cut grass. Plano likes its parties to look just right. And that evening, everything did. A banner with Noah's name stretched across the fence. Congratulations, graduate. I entered through the side gate. No one greeted me. No one called out my name. Just a few polite nods, the kind reserved for someone who isn't at the center of the story. My father stood near the grill. He laughed loudly, clapped relatives on the back, retelling the months when the family pushed through hard times. My mother passed by me, holding a tray of drinks. She paused for a very brief beat. "You came," she said. Then she kept walking. I stood still, listening to laughter, listening to the background music, and I realized the story had already been told before I ever opened my mouth. I heard my name mentioned, but not the way I expected. "This house is such a blessing," one aunt said. "Good thing it was saved in time." My father nodded. His voice carried clearly, loud enough for a few nearby tables to hear. "That's right. My family worked very hard, and now it will be the foundation for Noah's future." No one asked who had worked hard. No one mentioned the years of tightening belts. All the questions revolved around Noah, his career plans, how the bedroom would be renovated, what would be planted on the lawn. The house I had paid for month after month was being discussed as if it had simply fallen from good fortune. I looked down at my hands. They weren't shaking. They weren't clenched. There was only a familiar feeling being pushed to the side this time, in front of everyone. My father called everyone closer to the outdoor fireplace. He raised his glass. "Family is everything," he said. "We've gone through a lot to keep this roof over our heads, and now I'm proud to pass it on to my son." Scattered applause followed. Not loud, but loud enough to seal that version of the story. I looked toward Leonard Shaw. He stood at the edge of the yard, silent. His eyes never left my father. A very brief second passed. I knew I had two choices: smile or let the truth do its work. Leonard stepped forward half a step, just half a step. "Paul," he said calmly, "perhaps we should be careful with our wording, because this house isn't something that can simply be given as a gift." The air shifted, subtle, but unmistakable. If you are still listening to this story, comment the word "one" so I know you are still here with me. Now, let's return to that moment. My father gave an awkward laugh. I mean, everyone understands. But no one responded right away. A few glances shifted from my father to Leonard and then to me. No one asked questions. No one argued. But the atmosphere had changed. Conversations began to trail off. Some people made excuses to leave early. The music grew quieter, as if someone had absent-mindedly turned the volume down. I didn't say another word. I didn't need to. I just stood there for the first time, not stepping back so someone else could speak for me. And in that moment, I understood the story my family wanted to protect had begun to crack. The truth does not need to be shouted. It only needs to be placed in the right position. The party slowly dissolved without any clear ending. Congratulations became sparse. Handshakes lasted a little longer than necessary, as if everyone was weighing something before leaving. My father kept smiling, a smile that had clearly been rehearsed. But I could see his hand tightening around the plastic cup, not hard enough to draw attention, just hard enough to reveal a loss of control. Leonard stood beside me. He said nothing more. He understood that one carefully chosen sentence had already been spoken. So did I. That night, when I left, no one stopped me. No one asked anything. The back gate closed behind me with a very soft click. But I knew this much: the family story they were used to telling was no longer running as smoothly as before. The next morning, I sat across from Leonard Shaw in his office. Sunlight from the window fell directly onto the wooden desk, where folders were stacked neatly. "We're not going to turn this into a lecture on the law," Leonard said. "You just need to understand the core of it." He slid a sheet of paper toward me. On it was a familiar name, my father's, and directly beneath it, mine. When the loan was restructured, he explained, the person who carries the primary obligation doesn't just carry responsibility, they also hold control. I read slowly, not because it was hard to understand, but because I needed to be sure I wasn't imagining it. "So the house," I asked. "Cannot be transferred," Leonard said firmly. "Without your consent." I leaned back in my chair. A very strange feeling washed over me. Not satisfaction, not anger, clarity. All the years I had wondered why I was always pushed to the margins suddenly had a very simple answer: because I had never used what I already had. Leonard looked at me. "This doesn't automatically make them fair," he said. "It only ensures they can no longer keep telling the story while leaving you out." I nodded. "What's the next step?" I asked. Leonard opened another folder. Carefully, confidently. "The next step," he said, "is letting the system speak for you." I stood up, adjusted my bag, and for the first time in a very long while, I walked out of a room with the feeling that my hands were finally on the steering wheel. When the system speaks, no one can pretend they never knew. 3 days after the party, strangers appeared at the front door of the house. No flowers, no gifts, just thin folders and neutral expressions. Across the street, the neighbor Martha Reed stood on her porch, one hand shielding her eyes from the sun. She watched their every step, slowly, as if counting. My father opened the door. The familiar smile flickered, then vanished. There was no argument, no raised voices, only one sentence, repeated twice. "This house is currently under review." The door closed, and for the first time, the family story was no longer in the hands of the storyteller. News spread faster than any explanation ever could. That afternoon, a tow truck stopped at the driveway. The car Noah had treated as a symbol of a smooth, guaranteed future was hooked up. No one shouted, no one intervened. The driver simply did his job, the way the system always does. My mother stood behind the window, her hand gripping the curtain. She didn't cry. She just stared for a long time, as if trying to piece together fragments she had chosen not to see for years. Noah said nothing. For the first time, no one stepped in to shield him. That night, I received a short message. "You're taking this too far." I didn't reply. I returned to the old street as evening fell. The porch lights were on earlier than usual. Leonard stood beside me. No further words were needed. The door opened. My father saw us and understood immediately. Leonard spoke clearly, just firmly enough to leave no room for misunderstanding. "Any changes related to the house, from now on, require Vanessa's consent." There was no pleading, no anger, just the truth placed squarely on the table. I didn't step inside. There was no need. I turned away knowing that from this moment forward, everything they had once taken for granted no longer belonged to them. The next morning, the locks were changed, and the old key could no longer open that door. There was no loud victory, only people who had to learn how to live. Once the familiar umbrella was gone, the house was still there. The wooden fence, the maple tree by the porch light turning on at dusk, but everything around it began to change. The familiar cars parked in the driveway appeared less often. Relatives stopped by less, stayed shorter. No one asked me why. My father no longer stood by the grill on weekends. He moved in and out quietly, as if the house had suddenly become too large for an old story. My mother arranged things slowly, folding towels, stacking dishes, small tasks that once helped her believe everything was still fine. I didn't visit, not out of anger, but because I had stopped being the one who regulated everyone else's emotions. Noah moved out in silence. No farewell party, no post showing off his future. He looked for a job, failed, then tried again. Short phone calls, lower voices. For the first time, no one called me to fix things. No one assumed I would step in to patch the holes. My father called once. He only said, "You've made everything harder." I didn't argue. I didn't explain. Because I understood harder is not a bad thing when before. Everything had been far too easy. For those who never bore the consequences. The people who had patted Noah on the back at the party no longer called. Job applications came back without explanations. Interviews ended earlier than expected. No one asked about the house anymore. For the first time, Noah had to stand alone before the question, if the familiar shelter is gone, who am I? I returned to my own rhythm. Going to work early, coming home on time, cooking simple dinners enough to eat, enough to be calm. I reorganized my apartment, letting go of things I had kept just in case. There was no more just in case. I placed the files in a high cabinet, not to guard them, just to remind myself that the boundary had been set. Sometimes, I think about the years that passed. No regret, just lightness. No one tells my story for me anymore. And I don't need to retell it. Freedom doesn't make everything easier. It makes everything clearer. I began recalculating my long-term plans. Money, time, decisions no longer pulled off course by guilt. I didn't take revenge. I simply took responsibility for my own life, the very thing I had always been blocked from, by the word family. Some evenings, Plano is very quiet. The wind moves through the balcony. Streetlights turn on late. The city runs as if it has never known my family at all. I stand there, looking down at the parking lot, not waiting for anything. I didn't win against anyone in this story. I just stopped at the right moment. The house is no longer a symbol of sacrifice. It is an asset registered under the right name, operating by the proper rules, and I no longer disappear to keep peace for others. Peace doesn't arrive as a reward. It arrives when you stop allowing yourself to be pushed out of your own life. Peace does not arrive when everything is explained. It arrives when there is nothing left to prove. That morning, I woke up earlier than usual. The Plano sunlight poured through the curtains, soft and even. No phone buzzing, no flood of messages. No one needed me to handle something for them anymore. I made coffee. Steam rose slowly. The small apartment was so quiet I could hear the garbage truck at the end of the street. For the first time in a very long while, a morning did not begin with me absorbing someone else's emotions. I sat at the kitchen table, not thinking, just being there fully present. The house was no longer a symbol. It was a choice. I met Leonard one more time. No tension, no urgency, just practical questions. Keep it, rent it out, or sell it. We talked about numbers, about time, about what fit the life I was building. No one mentioned family. There was no need. I signed the paperwork. Neat, clear. The decision did not carry a sense of victory, only the certainty of someone living within boundaries she had set herself. The house continued to exist, but it no longer defined me. After meeting Leonard, I didn't go straight home. I drove around the old neighborhood, familiar streets, lawns trimmed on schedule. Everything looked the same, it just no longer belonged to me in the old way. I thought about the 5 years that had passed, not to regret them, but to make sure I carried no illusions into the next chapter. This decision was not just about today. It was about the years ahead, and I was clear-headed enough to carry that weight. I heard news about my family, through other people. My parents moved into a smaller rental house, closer to the city center. Fewer memories. Noah worked part-time, unstable, but self-supported. No one called me, and I didn't reach out either. Not because of resentment, but because this distance was real and necessary. I didn't close the door. I simply stopped standing in the doorway. Anyone who wants to step forward will have to walk on their own. There are no shortcuts. In the evening, I walked around the neighborhood. Streetlights turned on one by one. Plano was still Plano, but I wasn't the same. I no longer waited for recognition to feel present, no longer explained myself to be understood, no longer made myself smaller to fit into someone else's story. Life now wasn't bigger, it was the right size. In the days that followed, life became strangely ordinary. I went grocery shopping on Saturday morning, cooked meals for the week, scheduled medical checkups I had always postponed. No drama, no climax, just the feeling of no longer being pulled backward every time I stepped forward. And I realized peace is not loud, it only needs enough space for you to stand upright. Now, looking back, I can no longer remember the exact day everything ended. There was no clear milestone, just mornings that felt quieter than the ones before. I still live in Plano. I still go to work, still cook, still take walks on evenings when the wind is light. The city hasn't changed, but I have. There is no longer the feeling of waiting for a phone call to know whether I need to show up. No longer preparing answers for things I didn't cause. Life moves on unhurried, unburdened. I don't call it a victory. I call it being in my rightful place. There was a time when I believed family was the place where you had to endure the most. That silence was the way to keep the peace. That if you did enough, one day you would be seen. I was wrong. Halfway. Silence can keep the surface calm, but it can also pull you under very deeply if you stay there too long. What changed was not the house, not the paperwork. But the moment I understood this, boundaries are not betrayal. They are self-respect. I don't hate anyone in this story, and I don't need to be fully understood. Some relationships can only exist when you make yourself smaller, and some choices only appear when you dare to stand upright. I chose to stand upright. If you've listened this far, there was probably a moment in this story that made you slow down. Maybe it was when something that belonged to you was taken away for a reason that sounded perfectly reasonable, or when you realized you had been silent for too long just to keep things peaceful. I didn't tell this story to prove who was right, only to say this sometimes. The bravest thing you can do is reset your boundaries. Everyone's boundary is different. For some, it's money. For some, it's time. For some, it's respect. What about you? What moment made you realize that if you didn't say stop, you would keep losing yourself? If you want, share your story in the comments. Not to argue, just to be heard. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so I can share more meaningful and valuable stories with you. See you in the next story.